Sarah Martinez had always been good at blending in. After 8 years as a Navy SEAL, she had mastered the art of becoming invisible when necessary. Now, at 32, she lived a deliberately ordinary life in the small coastal town of Millfield, Oregon. Most people knew her as the friendly woman who ran the local coffee shop, Morning Brew, on Main Street. They had no idea that the petite woman with calloused hands and alert brown eyes had once conducted classified operations in some of the world's most dangerous places. The decision to leave the military hadn't been easy. Sarah had loved the brotherhood, the mission, and the sense of purpose that came with serving her country. But, after losing 3 teammates in a mission gone wrong in Afghanistan, she needed to step away. The nightmares were becoming too frequent, and the weight of command was crushing her spirit. Her commanding officer had understood, recommending her for an honorable discharge with full benefits. Millfield had been a random choice on a map. Sarah had driven up the Pacific Coast Highway after her discharge ceremony, looking for somewhere quiet to heal. The small town of 8,000 people sat nestled between rolling hills and a rocky coastline. It had exactly 1 main street, 2 gas stations, and the kind of community where everyone knew everyone else's business. For someone who had spent years operating in the shadows, it seemed like the perfect place to try living a normal life. She had bought the struggling coffee shop with her military savings and a small business loan. The previous owner, an elderly man named Frank, had been eager to retire and willing to sell at a reasonable price. Sarah threw herself into the work, learning everything about coffee beans, espresso machines, and small business management. The physical labor was therapeutic, and the daily routine of opening at 6 in the morning gave her life structure. The locals had been curious about the newcomer at first. Sarah kept her military background vague, telling people she had worked for the government before deciding to pursue her dream of running a coffee shop. Most people accepted this explanation without probing further. She developed friendships slowly, particularly with Martha, the elderly librarian who became a regular customer, and Tom, the local police chief who appreciated having someone in town who understood the importance of situational awareness. Life in Millfield was peaceful in a way Sarah had forgotten was possible. Her biggest daily challenges involved managing inventory, creating new drink specials, and mediating the occasional dispute between longtime residents about everything from parking spaces to the proper way to organize the annual Harvest Festival. She lived in a small apartment above the coffee shop, reading books in the evening and taking long walks along the beach to clear her mind. The coffee shop became a gathering place for the community. Every morning, the same group of retirees would occupy the corner table, solving the world's problems over black coffee and blueberry muffins. High school students would stop by after school for frappuccinos and study sessions. Local business owners used it as an informal meeting place. Sarah found genuine satisfaction in being part of the daily rhythm of people's lives. But, even in this peaceful setting, old habits died hard. Sarah still swept every room when she entered, noting exits and potential threats. She positioned herself with her back to walls whenever possible. Her morning runs along the beach served the dual purpose of exercise and reconnaissance, as she unconsciously mapped every trail, every hiding spot, and every potential escape route within a 5-mile radius of town. The transformation wasn't complete, and probably never would be. Sometimes, when a car backfired or someone dropped a tray of dishes, Sarah's hand would instinctively reach for a weapon that wasn't there. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones was difficult to turn off in civilian life. But, gradually, month by month, she was learning to relax. Sarah had been in Millfield for 18 months when Marcus Webb arrived in town. He came with big plans and bigger promises, presenting himself as a successful real estate developer from Los Angeles who saw tremendous potential in the area. Webb was a tall, silver-haired man in his 50s who wore expensive suits and drove a black Mercedes with California plates. He rented a suite at the town's only hotel and began scheduling meetings with local business owners and city council members. His pitch was compelling. Webb claimed he could transform Millfield into a premier coastal destination, bringing in tourists and their money while preserving the town's charm. He talked about boutique hotels, upscale restaurants, and art galleries that would create jobs and increase property values. Many residents were intrigued by the possibility of economic growth that had been stagnant for years. Sarah was among the business owners Webb approached. He visited Morning Brew on a Tuesday morning, ordering a large black coffee and introducing himself with a firm handshake and a practiced smile. He complimented the shop's atmosphere and location, then made his offer. He wanted to buy her building and several others on Main Street to create what he called an authentic coastal marketplace. The offer was generous, nearly double what Sarah had paid for the property. But something about Webb set her on edge. Maybe it was the way his eyes constantly scanned the room while he talked, or how his smile never quite reached his eyes. Her years in the military had taught her to trust her instincts about people, and every instinct was telling her that Marcus Webb was not what he appeared to be. Sarah politely declined his offer, explaining that she wasn't interested in selling. Webb remained friendly, but she noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. He suggested she think about it, mentioning that he was confident most of the other property owners would be eager to participate in the project. The implication was clear: she would eventually be surrounded by his development whether she participated or not. Over the following weeks, Webb's presence in Millfield became more prominent. He attended city council meetings, sponsored local events, and made generous donations to the volunteer fire department and the public library. Many residents began to see him as a benefactor who could solve the town's economic problems. Property owners who had been struggling to make ends meet were particularly enthusiastic about his offers. But Sarah noticed things others missed. She observed how Webb's assistant, a large man named Rick who always wore sunglasses, positioned himself to watch exits during meetings. She noted how Webb asked seemingly casual questions about people's personal lives, their finances, and their family situations. Most concerning was the way Webb's demeanor changed when he thought no one was watching. The friendly mask would slip, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. Sarah began doing her own quiet investigation. She used her old military contacts to run background checks on Webb and his associates. What she discovered was troubling. Marcus Webb's real estate development company was legitimate, but it was also connected to a network of shell companies and offshore accounts that suggested money laundering operations. Several of his previous development projects had been fronts for criminal enterprises, including drug trafficking and human smuggling. The pattern was always the same. Webb would identify small, economically struggling communities with strategic advantages, usually coastal access or proximity to major highways. He would present himself as a legitimate developer, gain the trust of local officials, and gradually take control of key properties. Once he had sufficient control, the real criminals would move in, using the towns as bases for illegal operations while hiding behind the facade of legitimate business. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah faced a difficult decision. She could quietly sell her property and leave town, avoiding whatever was coming. She could report her suspicions to federal authorities and hope they would investigate before Webb's plans advanced too far. Or she could stay and fight, using her skills to protect the community that had become her home. The decision became easier when Webb made his second visit to Morning Brew. This time, he wasn't alone. Rick accompanied him, along with another man Sarah immediately recognized as Muscle. The three men arrived just before closing time, when the shop was empty except for Sarah. Webb's tone was different this time, less friendly and more direct. He explained that his project was moving forward with or without her cooperation, but it would be much easier for everyone if she would reconsider his offer. When Sarah again declined, Webb's mask finally slipped completely. He leaned across the counter, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried unmistakable menace. He knew about her military service, he said. He knew she was alone in the world, with no family nearby and few close friends. Accidents happened to people who got in the way of progress. Businesses could be destroyed by health department violations, tax problems, or simple bad luck. It would be such a shame if something happened to her cozy little coffee shop, or to her. Sarah's response was calm and measured, her voice betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through her system. She thanked Webb for his concern but repeated that she wasn't interested in selling. She suggested that he and his friends leave, as she was closing for the evening. Webb stared at her for a long moment, perhaps expecting to see fear in her eyes. Instead, he saw only steady determination. As the three men left, Rick paused at the door. In a voice meant to sound casual but carrying clear threat, he mentioned that Sarah seemed to enjoy her morning runs on the beach. It would be terrible if she had an accident on those isolated trails. The message was unmistakable. They had been watching her, learning her routines, and they were prepared to escalate their threats to violence. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment above the coffee shop, staring out at the dark ocean and wrestling with her decision. She had come to Millfield to escape violence and find peace. But peace, she was learning, sometimes had to be fought for. And Marcus Webb had just made a critical error in judgment. He had threatened the wrong person. The morning after Webb's threatening visit, Sarah opened morning brew at her usual 6 o'clock, but her routine had changed in subtle ways that would have been invisible to most observers. She had repositioned the security mirrors to provide better sightlines throughout the shop. Her knife roll, normally stored in a locked drawer, was now within easy reach behind the counter. Most importantly, she had activated skills that had been dormant for 18 months. Sarah's military training had included extensive instruction in surveillance and counter-surveillance techniques. Now, she put that knowledge to work, systematically observing Webb's operation while appearing to maintain her normal daily routine. During her morning runs, she varied her routes and timing, using the exercise to conduct reconnaissance on Webb's activities around town. She discovered that Rick and the other man, who went by the name Eddie, were staying at a rental house on the outskirts of Millfield. Through careful observation, Sarah mapped their daily patterns. Webb spent most of his time in meetings with local officials and property owners, always accompanied by at least one of his men. Rick seemed to handle security and intimidation, while Eddie appeared to be responsible for what Sarah suspected was preliminary site preparation for whatever illegal activities Webb was planning. She noted that they received regular visitors, men in expensive cars who never stayed long and always met away from the town center. Sarah also began reaching out to her former military contacts, using encrypted communication methods she hadn't employed since leaving the service. Her old unit commander, Colonel James Harrison, was now working in military intelligence liaison with federal law enforcement. When Sarah explained her situation, Harrison was immediately concerned. He confirmed her suspicions about Webb's background and revealed that federal agencies had been tracking the organization for months, but had never been able to gather sufficient evidence for prosecution. The challenge was that Webb's operation was sophisticated and cautious. They used legitimate business fronts, employed lawyers who specialized in finding legal loopholes, and were careful to avoid activities that would trigger federal investigation triggers. Local law enforcement was typically either corrupted or simply overwhelmed by resources and expertise the criminals brought to bear. Harrison explained that federal agencies were aware of Webb's pattern but had always arrived too late to gather actionable intelligence. By the time they received reports of suspicious activity, Webb's organization had already established control and intimidated potential witnesses into silence. Millfield represented an opportunity to catch them in the early stages of their operation, but it would require someone on the inside who could gather evidence without being detected. Sarah realized she was uniquely positioned to serve that role. Her military background gave her the skills necessary for covert observation and evidence gathering. Her position as a local business owner provided legitimate reasons to be present throughout the town. Most importantly, Webb's organization had already identified her as a potential problem, which meant they would likely reveal more of their methods in dealing with her. She agreed to work informally with federal investigators, understanding that she would be operating without official backing or protection. If Webb discovered her activities, she would be on her own until federal agents could respond. But Sarah had operated in hostile territory before, and she preferred taking action to waiting helplessly for criminals to destroy her adopted home. The first phase of her investigation focused on documenting Webb's meetings and identifying his associates. Sarah installed small, nearly invisible cameras in locations around Main Street where she had legitimate access. She used her morning coffee delivery routine to several businesses as cover for placing surveillance devices. The coffee shop's central location made it an ideal observation post, and Sarah modified her seating arrangements to provide clear sightlines to key locations. Within 2 weeks, Sarah had documented a disturbing pattern of intimidation and coercion. Webb wasn't simply making generous offers to property owners, he was systematically pressuring them through a combination of financial manipulation and subtle threats. Business owners who declined his initial offers found themselves facing sudden problems with suppliers, unexpected health department inspections, and mysterious difficulties with their insurance companies. Martha, the elderly librarian, was among the first to experience Webb's pressure tactics. Her small house on Elm Street was located in the center of the area Webb wanted for his development. When she politely declined his offer, she began receiving visits from Rick and Eddie, who would sit in their car outside her house for hours, ostensibly reading newspapers but clearly watching her movements. Her mail began arriving late or not at all. A brick was thrown through her front window one night, with no witnesses and no evidence pointing to any specific perpetrator. Tom, the police chief, was frustrated by the situation but found his hands tied. The incidents were minor individually, and Webb's men were careful never to do anything that could be directly linked back to them. When Tom tried to investigate, he was politely stonewalled by expensive lawyers who cited privacy rights and demanded evidence of specific crimes. The town's small police department lacked the resources for the kind of sophisticated investigation that would be needed to build a case. Sarah documented each incident, building a comprehensive picture of Webb's operation that federal investigators could use. But she also realized that evidence gathering alone might not be sufficient. Webb's organization was moving quickly to consolidate control, and several property owners were beginning to waver under the pressure. If too many people sold their properties, Webb would achieve the critical mass needed to proceed with his real agenda. The situation escalated when Eddie made a direct approach to Sarah during one of her morning runs. She was following a trail along the bluffs overlooking the ocean when he appeared, blocking her path with his large frame. He was alone, apparently believing that intimidating a small woman would be a simple task. Eddie's approach was crude compared to Webb's sophisticated psychological pressure. He told Sarah directly that her continued resistance was causing problems for important people. He suggested that accidents could happen to anyone, especially someone who exercised alone in isolated areas. When Sarah attempted to continue her run, Eddie grabbed her arm, his grip painful and clearly intended to bruise. What happened next was over so quickly that Eddie never fully understood what had occurred. Sarah's response was instinctive, drawing on years of close-quarters combat training. She broke his grip with a simple but effective joint manipulation, simultaneously striking a nerve cluster that temporarily paralyzed his arm. Before Eddie could react, Sarah had positioned herself behind him with his arm locked in a submission hold that could easily break bones if he struggled. Instead of escalating the violence, Sarah spoke quietly in Eddie's ear, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had commanded troops in combat. She explained that she was not the helpless victim he had assumed her to be. She suggested that he return to Webb and inform him that further attempts at intimidation would be met with appropriate responses. She released him and continued her run, leaving Eddie nursing his arm and trying to process what had just happened. The encounter marked a turning point in the conflict. When Eddie reported back to Webb, the criminal leader realized that Sarah represented a more significant threat than he had initially assessed. His background research had revealed her military service, but he had underestimated what that meant in practical terms. Webb was accustomed to dealing with frightened civilians and overwhelmed local officials, not with trained operators who could match his organization's capacity for violence. Webb's response was to escalate his timeline and increase pressure on other property owners while developing a more comprehensive strategy for dealing with Sarah. He recognized that direct confrontation might be counterproductive, so he began exploring other approaches. If Sarah couldn't be intimidated, perhaps she could be isolated from community support or framed for criminal activity. Sarah observed these changes in Webb's behavior and realized that her intervention had bought time but also increased the danger to herself and the community. Webb's organization was now focused on her as a primary obstacle to their plans, which meant they would eventually commit resources to removing her from the equation. She needed to accelerate her evidence gathering while preparing for more serious attempts to neutralize her. Through her federal contacts, Sarah learned that Webb's organization had used similar escalation patterns in other locations. When faced with unexpected resistance, they typically responded by manufacturing criminal charges against their opponents, using corrupted local officials or fabricated evidence to remove problems through the legal system. If that approach failed, they were prepared to use more direct methods. Sarah realized that time was running out for a law enforcement solution. federal agencies were still months away from building a prosecutable case, and Webb's organization was preparing to eliminate local resistance within weeks. The residents of Millfield were depending on protection that might not arrive in time. That evening, as Sarah closed the coffee shop and prepared for what she suspected would be Webb's next escalation, she made a decision that would have been unthinkable 18 months earlier. She was going to stop running from her military past and embrace the skills that had made her an elite warrior. Webb had threatened her community, and now he was going to discover what happened when someone crossed a Navy SEAL who had found something worth fighting for. The quiet life she had built in Millfield was about to give way to something far more dangerous, but Sarah no longer had any choice in the matter. Webb had forced her hand, and now she would show him exactly why that had been a fatal mistake. Webb's next move came 3 days after Eddie's encounter with Sarah on the running trail. It was a Wednesday evening, and Sarah was conducting her final security check of morning brew when she noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable to someone with her training: accelerant. Someone had splashed gasoline around the exterior of her building. Moving carefully through the darkened coffee shop, Sarah used her phone's camera to photograph the evidence before calling Tom, the police chief. While waiting for his arrival, she employed techniques learned in combat zones to secure the area and document everything that might be relevant for investigation. She found a crude timing device hidden behind the dumpster in the alley, designed to ignite the accelerant sometime after midnight when the building would be empty, but the fire would spread to adjacent structures. Tom arrived within minutes, followed shortly by the volunteer fire department. The evidence was clear and the intent obvious. Webb's organization had decided that if they couldn't buy Sarah's property, they would destroy it. The insurance money would eventually compensate her financial loss, but the message was equally clear. Continued resistance would result in escalation to more serious attacks. But Webb had miscalculated. The arson attempt provided exactly the kind of evidence that federal law enforcement needed to justify immediate intervention. Sarah's contact, Colonel Harrison, expedited the process, and, by Thursday morning, FBI agents were en route to Millfield. More importantly for Sarah's immediate situation, the attack had crossed a line that transformed her from reluctant participant to active combatant. Sarah spent Thursday morning putting her affairs in order with the methodical precision of someone preparing for battle. She arranged for temporary management of the coffee shop, secured her important documents, and activated emergency protocols she had hoped never to use. By afternoon, she had transformed from a small business owner into something Webb's organization had never encountered: a one-person special operations unit operating on home territory she knew better than anyone else. The first indication Webb received that his situation had changed came Thursday evening. Eddie had been assigned to watch Sarah's apartment, using night vision equipment to monitor her movements from a position in the hills overlooking Main Street. At approximately 10 o'clock, he lost visual contact when Sarah appeared to turn off her lights and go to bed. At 10:30, she was standing directly behind him. Sarah had used a route that was invisible from Eddie's position, approaching through terrain she had mapped during months of morning runs. Her night movement technique, learned in Afghanistan and practiced countless times in hostile territory, allowed her to cover the distance without being detected by either visual observation or the motion sensors Webb's men had installed around the town. Eddie's first indication that he was no longer alone was when Sarah spoke quietly in his ear, informing him that his night vision equipment, radio, and weapons were now in her possession. She had disarmed him completely without him realizing she was present. Before Eddie could react, Sarah had secured him with zip ties and positioned him where he could watch what happened next. Sarah's message to Webb was delivered through direct action rather than words. Over the next 2 hours, she systematically dismantled the surveillance network his organization had established around Millfield. Every camera, motion sensor, and listening device was located and disabled. More importantly, Sarah replaced Webb's surveillance equipment with her own devices, turning his intelligence network against him. Using techniques learned in special operations, Sarah had essentially reversed the surveillance situation overnight. Webb's organization, which had been operating with complete intelligence dominance, was now blind while Sarah could monitor their every movement. Eddie remained secured in the hills as a witness, able to observe Sarah's capabilities but unable to warn his associates until she chose to release him. Friday morning brought Webb his first real understanding of what he was facing. Sarah had left Eddie zip-tied to a tree with a simple note: "Your surveillance network has been neutralized. Federal agents are en route. Leave town immediately or face the consequences of threatening American citizens." Webb's response revealed both his desperation and his fundamental misunderstanding of his opponent. Instead of heeding the warning, he decided to escalate to direct violence. He contacted additional associates from Los Angeles, bringing in what he considered a professional team to handle one problematic local resident. By Friday evening, 8 armed men had arrived in Millfield with instructions to eliminate Sarah and destroy any evidence of the organization's activities. Sarah had anticipated this escalation and prepared accordingly. Using her knowledge of the town's geography and her access to buildings throughout the downtown area, she had created what amounted to a defensive network that would have been familiar to any military strategist. Every approach to Main Street was under observation. Multiple escape routes were prepared and equipped with supplies. Most importantly, Sarah had positioned herself with clear intelligence about her opponent's location and intentions. The confrontation began at approximately 9 o'clock Friday evening, when Webb's team attempted to surround Sarah's coffee shop. They had planned a coordinated assault, expecting to overwhelm a single opponent through superior numbers and firepower. Instead, they found themselves entering a carefully prepared battlefield where Sarah controlled every advantage. Sarah's first action was to trigger the fire alarm system throughout downtown Millfield, ensuring that civilians would evacuate the area and emergency responders would be summoned. Her second action was to disable the street lighting in a pattern that created dark zones where she could move unseen while channeling her opponents into areas where they could be observed and engaged. The engagement that followed would later be studied by military tacticians as an example of how superior training and preparation could overcome numerical disadvantage. Sarah used classic guerrilla warfare techniques, engaging individual members of Webb's team in locations and circumstances that prevented them from supporting each other effectively. The first 2 men were neutralized when they attempted to breach the coffee shop through the rear entrance. Sarah had anticipated this approach and prepared accordingly, using non-lethal but highly effective techniques to incapacitate them before they could raise an alarm. The third man lost consciousness when he triggered a carefully placed device while attempting to cut power to the building. By the time Webb realized that his team was being systematically eliminated, Sarah had already secured 3 weapons and established positions that gave her commanding views of the remaining approach routes. The engagement had evolved from an assault into a siege, but Sarah controlled the terms of that siege completely. Webb's final mistake was attempting to use Martha, the elderly librarian, as leverage. 2 of his remaining men had taken her from her house, believing they could force Sarah to surrender by threatening an innocent civilian. They demanded that Sarah meet them in the town square, offering to exchange Martha for Sarah's surrender. Sarah's response demonstrated why threatening innocence against a trained operator is always a tactical error. Instead of surrendering, she used techniques perfected in hostage rescue operations to eliminate both threats simultaneously. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds and ended with Martha unharmed and her captors unconscious. The arrival of FBI agents at midnight found a surreal scene in downtown Millfield. 8 armed criminals were secured with zip ties in various locations throughout the town, all unconscious but alive and requiring medical attention for injuries that were painful but not life-threatening. Webb himself was found in his hotel room, also secured, with detailed documentation of his organization's activities neatly organized for federal investigators. Sarah had disappeared by the time law enforcement secured the scene, leaving behind a comprehensive intelligence package that provided everything federal agencies needed to prosecute not just Webb's immediate organization, but the broader criminal network they represented. Her final message was delivered through Tom, the police chief: the town was secure, the threat was neutralized, and federal investigators would find everything they needed to ensure justice was served. 3 months later, Martha reopened the Morning Brew coffee shop under new management. Sarah had left detailed instructions for operation and a trust fund sufficient to ensure the business would continue serving the community indefinitely. A simple plaque by the door read, "Dedicated to all who serve others with courage and honor." Residents of Millfield never saw Sarah Martinez again, though some reported seeing a familiar figure running on the beach at dawn, always alone and always alert. Federal prosecutors used the evidence she provided to dismantle Webb's criminal organization and prosecute dozens of associates across multiple states. Webb himself received a federal sentence that would ensure he never threatened another small community. The case became required reading at federal law enforcement academies as an example of how a single well-trained individual, fighting to protect something they valued, could neutralize a sophisticated criminal organization. For the residents of Millfield, it served as proof that sometimes guardian angels come in unexpected forms, and that evil men who threaten peaceful communities sometimes discover they have chosen the wrong target. Sarah had come to Millfield seeking peace and found a home worth fighting for. In defending that home, she had rediscovered that her military training and experience could serve a purpose beyond warfare. They could protect innocent people from those who would prey upon them. Webb and his organization had learned, too late, why you never cross a Navy SEAL who has found something worth protecting. The quiet coastal town returned to its peaceful routine, but residents would always remember the week when their community was defended by someone who embodied the warrior's creed, to protect those who cannot protect themselves, regardless of personal cost. Sarah Martinez had given them that protection and, then, faded back into the shadows, leaving behind only the knowledge that sometimes, when good people are threatened by evil, a guardian emerges to restore the balance.